Thanks, Ingrid. Welcome, everybody. We're just loading participants in. Thanks for joining today. This voice is Kirsten Green, and I will open it up in just a moment and introduce our moderator, Mayor Mark Gamba. Ingrid, I see 33 folks moved over. Are there more in the attendance list, or is that pretty much for now?
There's 28 I'm seeing in the attendees right now.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, everyone, thanks. I see Mayor Mark Gamba among us now. Thank you, Mayor.
Hey, nice to see you all.
Excellent. Sorry, you were over in the Zoom waiting room there, but now you're in.
No worries, it's probably my fault. I probably used the wrong link or something.
No, how could you get the wrong link if we didn't send it to you, Mayor? So thank you. No. Everyone, I just would like to welcome you. My name is Kirsten Green. I'm the Deputy Director, the honor of being the Deputy Director here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And our agency is in the midst of a really important rulemaking process called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking. And this is according to Governor Brown's executive order from last spring, directing state agencies to work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our communities. Part of this work, and kind of just what we know over time intuitively as community planners, is that populations grow. And so the question today, and Mayor Gamba will moderate us through, the question today is, how do we grow more humanely, more sustainably, in a way that's good for mental health and as well as for the planet? So just to introduce Mayor Gamba before I hand it over to him, Mayor Gamba has been mayor since in Milwaukee since 2015. He's lived and worked in Oregon for 20 years and has traveled all over the world as a professional photographer with many assignments, including for National Geographic. Mayor Gamba, I had the chance to work with and for Mayor Gamba on the community's vision back when I was in consulting, and also their comprehensive plan update and their climate action plan. So I can attest to the mayor and his council's commitment to livable communities. It is it's exemplary in the state, and we're just really privileged today that, Mayor, you've making time to share your experiences and kind of what's going on in Milwaukee with us. I have a feeling this is the first of several conversations about how to create and grow more livable communities as we reshape ourselves over time in a more sustainable way. I think that Evan just had, I want to give a shout out to, before I hand it off, Mayor, if that's okay, to Evan Manville and Ingrid Caudell, who have helped us put this event together. And yes, Evan, if you don't mind going back, I'll give some of those behavioral rules. So, be on mute if you're not speaking, and we will help you come off mute during the question and answer segment. Feel free to use the chat. I'll help Mayor monitor that. We may wait until the end to get into the questions, but please go ahead and roll them in there. And phone users, if you have a question, please press *9 on your phone to raise your hand. Today's presentation is being recorded and we will share it on our website. Thank you. With that, I turn it over to Mayor Gamba. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Kirsten. And Kirsten was very humble about the way she presented her work with us on our vision. We won 2 awards for that work statewide, and actually one of them was national. And it was in almost 95% due to her and her team. So she's an extraordinary person, and we're all lucky to have her in the position she's at. Is Bob not joining us today?
Bob is in a legislative hearing. He will join us momentarily.
Okay, perfect. Great. Well, I'll talk a little bit about what Milwaukee's been up to, and then I'll introduce each panelist as they're about to speak. So as Kirsten said, we set a vision a few years ago our 2040 vision that really has laid out the work for everything else that we've done, our climate action plan, our comprehensive plan, everything will encompass what the vision laid out. And the first line in the vision is, in 2040, Milwaukee is a flourishing city that is entirely equitable, delightfully livable, and completely sustainable. That, to me, incorporates everything that we need to be thinking about when we're trying to create a city that is the best possible place to live. So as I said, that then informed our climate action plan, which was the next piece. We were the first city to declare a climate state of emergency in Oregon. And our climate action plan now calls for the city to be net zero electricity by 2030, net zero building energy by 2035, and completely carbon neutral citywide by 2045. We're doing a lot of things to head that direction. Two of them are bills that we have in Salem right now. One to allow us to require more stringent energy efficiency code in the building code for new buildings, because we've got a lot of new construction coming in Milwaukee. And the other one is to allow us to form a green tariff with PGE so that we hit that net zero by 2030 goal. Though that work will continue, and obviously there's a lot more to that. Some of the things that we've been doing, and some of this even started before the vision, investment in our active transportation infrastructure. We're investing over 9 years, $52 million in bike and pedestrian infrastructure throughout the city. Our goal is to make it safe and comfortable and enjoyable for families to get anywhere that they want to get in the city by bike or walking safely. That work is ongoing. Our tree goal that came out of the climate action plan is to increase our canopy from 23%, which it currently is, to 40% over about the next 20 years. We've done things like put a price on trees. Trees now have an empirical value, so that when an engineer is looking at a project, putting in a sidewalk, for example, if there's a big tree there, it may become more cost effective for the project to route the sidewalk around the tree rather than just cutting the tree down. But stormwater, we are increasingly prioritizing storm swales rather than piping. And when there is overflow piping, or still in some instances where there's just piping, we are filtering the water so that by the time it gets to the creeks, it is at least cleaner, if not clean. And our comprehensive plan, into which all of this is being boiled, our climate work, our equity work, which will set it in code for the next probably 20 or 30 years, because that's about how often we do a new comp plan. We're looking to erase the racist zoning laws that have been in place for decades and decades, to allow and encourage less expensive and more sustainable forms of housing, middle housing, to prioritize the tree canopy in our zoning, in land division, and along with natural spaces, to protect the natural spaces that exist, while continuing to allow for thoughtful densification, because we know that at least a well thought through city is more sustainable if it is more dense. It allows for more services to more people. So that's the really Reader's Digest version of what's going on in Milwaukee. Much like the rest of this panel, I could probably talk for 3 hours about that. I think one of the things that all three members of this panel have in common is that they seem to be very deep thinkers that seem to take a holistic view of the way all things are interconnected. and they have very cross-disciplinary expertise that they bring to their work. I personally would like to become best friends with all three of them so that I could sort of through osmosis absorb some of the collective wisdom. But we will get to hear some of the tiny little bit of that wisdom today. We'll start with Dr. Vivek Shandas. He's a professor at PSU. He specializes in developing strategies for addressing the implications of climate change on cities. His teaching and his research examine the intersection of exposure to climate-induced events, governance processes, and planning mechanisms. As an interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Shandas studies the emergent characteristics that generate vulnerability among communities and infrastructure. Empirically, Dr. Shandas examines the human and planetary forces that facilitate or inhibit collective response. As such, the broad aims of his teaching and research are to identify threats to planetary habitation and shape landscapes to improve urban environmental quality. Dr. Shandas serves as the research director for PSU's Institute for Sustainable Solutions, where he supports cross-disciplinary efforts to address pressing challenges facing communities around the world. And as the founder and director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research, it's SUPER, it's a great acronym. He brings a policy relevant approach to research, including the evaluation of environmental stressors on human health, developing indicators and tools to improve decision-making and the construction of frameworks to guide the growth of urban regions. Over the past several years, research from the Super Lab has appeared in the Smithsonian Magazine, National Public Radio, Washington Post, Minnesota Public Broadcasting, New York Times, the Qatar Times, and several other national and international media. I am very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Vivek Shandas.
Thank you, Mayor Gamba. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Evan. Really privileged to be here, able to share a few minutes of conversation about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, of green infrastructure. I have a few slides. Am I able to share those? Yeah, there we go. Great. I just assembled a few slides here just to kind of help me more or less stay on track with some of the topics because we have very limited time. I just do that mainly so I can stay afloat on the main topics. But I have a distinct privilege in some ways to be at a university, also to have a window with the Urban Forestry Commission with the city of Portland, which allows me to kind of see the mechanics of the sausage making of green infrastructure, if you will. And it's really interesting to kind of put that in context of some of the like 10,000 or even 30,000 square foot perspective I'm going to give. And I believe that Bob and Shantae are going to bring this down to the ground. And I'm really honored to be able to chat with and share the time with Bob and Shantae on this conversation, because it's something that's not going away anytime soon. And as we'll talk about in this conversation, with your everyday experiences, green infrastructure really becomes a very significant effect on our health and well-being. And so I really want to frame this as a broad concept of how do we think about gray infrastructure, being able to move water, being able to move sewage, et cetera, and the role that green infrastructure really plays in terms of how it's, for a very long time, whether we care to admit it or not, has been essential for our health and well-being, not only based on the food we eat, not only based on the soils that we walk on, but also the air we breathe, and of course, the climate we're experiencing. And so this really comes around when a person's walking on a sidewalk that's well shaded versus a sidewalk that isn't, as we're seeing warmer days emerge in large part due to the climate age that we're really embarking upon now, with radical large shifts in the entire planetary climate system that play out at the local level. The experience of what people have in their homes, on the sidewalks, is all going to be mediated in part by what is around those homes and what's within those homes. And green infrastructure in that way plays a really essential role. So as we think about the fatalities, and just to kind of bring this out in full effect here, we do see more fatalities from weather-related events from heat than we do any other natural hazard. And that is an increasing concern in the Pacific Northwest, in part because we're kind of a very ill-equipped region for these heat waves. We've had very temperate weather. We've had the lovely long stretches of spring and fall, but now as we're seeing temperatures go up and we're seeing days above 90 go up, that really means a lot to our ability to manage the urban environments and our region in a safe and habitable way. And so part of where green infrastructure comes into this is the fact that there is a lot of these invisible, what we call ecosystem services that really directly contribute to our health and well-being. And several of us have been deep into the study of ecosystem services, though what we're finding and what the research around the country is finding is that these ecosystem services that plants have been providing us for free for in such graceful ways have been essentially distributed in very inequitable ways. And for a long time, we've been asking the question of, I've been asking my colleagues around the country, like, why are we seeing often whiter, wealthier communities with so much leafier neighborhoods as opposed to neighborhoods that haven't? And they would often lean back and say, you know, this has to do with the luxury effect. The fact that people who have more money can hire, you know, landscapers can come in and prune their trees, plant more trees. And I've been really unsatisfied and with that kind of individualistic approach, and really thinking more about what are the systems in place that have created these inequities to begin with. And that's where a couple of us last year, last year we published a paper looking at this one policy that went in, and Mayor Gamba referenced this, is one policy that went in back in the 1930s known as redlining. And this was on the back of other things that were happening in the state already, though this redlining policies, regardless of where you lived, really allowed banks to identify what were, quote, the riskiest places for lending mortgages. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with green infrastructure? But it turns out when we look at these redlined areas, these are the red dots in any city that you could point a finger at in the US, there was some form of this, whether it be through racial covenants or whether it be through formal redlining policies that were codified by the federal government. This was some way of finding its way into our cities. And so communities that were often targeted are African-American, Black communities, and communities of color, and low-income communities and immigrant communities. Those were often the folks, wherever they lived, local planners, agencies would mark red lines and codify those as very risky investments, and therefore disinvestment went in over time into those areas and investments went into other places. And so when we start looking at we looked at 108 cities across the country and seeing, was this a systemic needle in a haystack that we could find in order to help describe this distributional inequity of green infrastructure around the country? And what we found pretty quickly was that at the national level, these green areas were considered the best by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal agency that administered a lot of the loans and the investments that happen through banks to these areas. So the green areas were, quote, considered the best. The blues were considered desirable. The yellow areas were still declining, and the D areas were considered as hazardous. And this hazardous areas and these declining areas were often chalked up as the areas that were highly disinvested. Though regardless of whether we looked at the West, the South, the Northeast, or the Midwest, tree canopy amounts as one measure of green infrastructure were consistently lower in these redlined areas as opposed to their non-redlined counterparts. And this was a systemic issue across the country, across all 108 cities that we looked at. And if we look more specifically at what is actually on the ground in these areas, we start seeing that as a general measure of tree canopy, this A, B, C, and D grading, the D areas, which were the redlined areas in these cities, the segregated areas where communities of color, immigrants, low-income communities often lived, those had more asphalt and concrete than their non-redlined counterparts today, right? So this was a policy almost 100 years ago, and we're seeing that legacy play out today in terms of what's on the landscape. And what was more pernicious about this is that by disinvestment over decades, imagine when Eisenhower in the 50s was ready to make the German Autobahn a reality in the United States and wanted to put down massive freeways everywhere, guess where those freeways would often go? They would go to places that were by design disinvested and had the lowest land rents over time. And so we see the big box stores, the large housing projects, the freeways going right into those intentionally disinvested areas. And so those were the areas, the neighborhoods that were fragmented, the social capital that was broken, and all the other schools and service investments that were slowly then deteriorating as well. And so when we look at these patterns and we start asking ourselves, like, how do we adjust this? How do we actually move out of this? And some recent research that we've done illustrates how hard it is for us to get out of this pattern, because what we're essentially seeing is these C and D neighborhoods. We're talking about, areas, Old Town in Portland, Old Town, Chinatown, Albina, Mississippi. And for your own towns, anywhere in the state, there were likely some racial covenants that played out that would play out in similar ways. Because we have a hunch that if this played out in these larger cities across the country, it's a likely hunch to be able to say this was also playing out in smaller communities around the country as well, though that evidence is still forthcoming. And so part of what ended up happening is this lack of green space and parks that were also lacking in these historically redlined areas. And where that gets us now is a model that a colleague of mine, Chris Schell, and I have been working on, thinking about how residential segregation back in the day leads to resource distribution, leads to changes in the landscape that then ultimately affects the biological community, or the ability of green infrastructure to actually survive and thrive in an area. And this got further articulated as I come around the corner with the last couple of slides here, in trying to think about how the systemic biases within the institutions that many of us serve in, translate to forms of structural racism and classism that then perpetuate their ways into the landscapes that we inhabit. And how that plays out, we've been able to document it in terms of impervious surface, in terms of heat, in terms of green space. Recent research has shown much more connections to environmental pollutants and how that has exacerbated, for example, COVID likelihood as well. And so these are kind of processes that are playing out right under our noses. And the fact that we're talking about green infrastructure, it's not as if all neighborhoods are starting off in the same place. And that's kind of the punchline of everything that I have been wanting to contribute to this conversation, is that different neighborhoods are starting from very different places. And if I'm talking to a planner who's doing a cost benefit assessment of how do I get 22,000 trees into the ground, and they're trying to figure that out, it's going to cost more to tear up concrete and asphalt and get a tree into the ground than it is in a place that already has lots of open space by design, where all it is a shovel, some water, and a crew to be able to get the tree into the ground. Very different realities when we're talking about green infrastructure and how to get it into the ground, not to mention all the competition for utilities and the like, and overhead power lines and other considerations that come into play when we're talking about these dynamics that play out. So with that, I just want to kind of come around and provoke you with some kind of higher level thoughts about why this is such a complex and difficult conversation to have about green infrastructure, because we are kind of trying to address some of this locked in landscape realities when we're trying to bring green infrastructure into our urban environments. So I'll stop sharing there, and I believe I'm turning it over to—
I'll get back to Mayor, because he's going to,
Mayor
yep,
Gamba.
thank you.
Thank you. That was really good. And I'm absolutely positive I could listen to you for another 8 hours. Shantae Johnson is our next speaker, and she is the Unity Farm Manager at MUDBONE Grown Farm. She's also a certified community health worker, a doula, a breastfeeding peer counselor, an urban farmer, and a food justice warrior. She is a cultural bridge builder with strengths in community organizing, project management, and program creation with a public health lens. She's a parent, a healer, a chef, and a referee to their 6 beautiful children. Shantae also has been appointed to the Oregon Board of Agriculture by Governor Kate Brown. She will sit on the advisory committee to represent small-scale producers, that's something I hope we see a whole lot more of, start breaking up some of the big farms into small scale production. And she's been appointed to the Governor's Racial Justice Council as well. Shantae, can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for having me. Oh, goodness, just one moment here. 20% screen. Bear with my technology here.
No problem.
All right. I am so happy to be with you all today. Just one moment, my charger. It's always something. My charger came out of my computer and I don't want to lose connection with you all.
We don't want that either, Shantae. Please feel free to take a moment.
Yes.
Anything you
realize.
can do to stay with us.
Yeah. All right. Here we are. So I'm joining you today from Corbett, Oregon. And the farm that I tend is about 19 acres. But for the purpose of today, we're going to talk a lot about my urban farm experience in managing our Oregon Food Bank farm. So this first picture is it was a 2-acre farm that we worked with the Oregon Food Bank on to get food out to community. And so in thinking about green infrastructure and farming, we need to get really creative in our approaches and how we do community engagement and working with community instead of for community. And so just to give you all a little bit of background about my farm business and kind of, you know, where I'm coming from. We started farming about 6 years ago, and we started off at Arbor Lodge Urban Farm, which was about 1 acre. And we knew that first season that we were going to only be able to farm there for 1 year. They were going to be building affordable housing. And so this is going to really speak to the story around gentrification and how it displaces urban farms and what we can do to have some creative solutions around that as well. So we were at Arbor Lodge Urban Farm, like I said, for about 1 year. We had that season to go at it. And with the, you know, with that first season, a lot of community came out and we're really excited about the fact that we were right there in community. It was off of Interstate and Rosa Parks Way. So it was a great location. But because Central City Concern needed to build affordable housing, we had to look for another location. And so that story is not unique to many urban farmers. Often you're allowed to use a space, whether that be for free or for lease for a short period of time, and then you have to often move to another location. So from there, you know, we were able to get to the Oregon Food Bank site. Since we've been farming for the past 6 years, we've created 3 agricultural training programs that specifically focus on Black, Indigenous, and POC farmers. So we have received some USDA funding to help to implement those programs. One is a program that was focused on Black, Indigenous, and POC farmers, teaching them how to farm. Our second one was the Boots to Roots program, focusing on veteran farmers and working with our local VA. And we were like one of 10 that were awarded a pilot program grant to be able to teach veterans how to farm. And then lastly, our Pathways to Farming program, which sits at the Oregon Food Bank location. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The approach around growing that we take is really centered in ecological ancestral knowledge. And what I mean by that is that both Arthur and I are both Portland natives and really have a love for the state of Oregon and all the beauty that it has to offer. We both grew up learning how to farm and garden from our grandmothers, which are very important to us in this work. And so we really sit on the shoulders of not only our grandmothers and our ancestors, but also on the shoulders of the work that's been happening for generations here in the state. So there was a wonderful woman by the name of Vivian Barnett, who helped to start community gardens here in Oregon back in the 1960s. And so she really helped to develop out the community garden model and helped to activate over 1,000 Black families to be able to activate their own community farms and gardens. It was called the Green Fingers Project. And so we were working with Portland, or we have been working with Portland State University to capture some of those stories and return some of that back to the community. So we're really excited about that part. I mentioned the ecological knowledge, which, for most folks, when we talk about ecological ancestral knowledge, a lot of folks talk about regenerative agriculture. And so regenerative agriculture is not a new term. Many communities have been practicing good agricultural practices over, centuries and generations. So some of the things that stood out to me around regenerative agriculture were, it's looking at improving soil health, increasing biodiversity, capturing carbon, integrating livestock. So, a lot of folks will have chickens, or they'll have, even goats in the city or things like that. And also looking at increasing community well-being. There's a huge community component when we look at urban farming and working with and for community. One thing that really stands out with farming at the Oregon Food Bank was that folks had been farming there for about 10 years, and it was a very unique location. I can tell you that not only did the police department use it to train horses prior to it being farmed, but the Buffalo Soldiers also used that spot to train horses as well. And so it did have a great history, prior to it being farmed. And once we got there, they had been farming there for about 10 years. There was a lot of master gardeners and things like that. But once we arrived, we were able to bring a lot more diverse community members to that farm site and help to activate it. When we think about food, food helps to bring community together in many different aspects. And so once people found out that we were at the Oregon Food Bank location, we had visits, we had volunteers from all over the place, from schools. We did school field trips to folks that wanted to be a part of the farm, from Nike, from Wells Fargo. We had more than 1,200 volunteers in one quarter, just to let you know the big impact that we had on just a little 1 acre farm. And so it really does bring community quite a bit together. These are some pictures from our farm out in Corbett, and also in the city with vegetable giveaways that come from the farm. We've also participated in a lot of CSA programs. So, just helping you to think and to tie in the fact that when we think about local food or hyper local food, it's really important that we leave spaces for these green spaces within the city. We can look at the pandemic. This is a picture of the farm when it was in full action. And so it was a very beautiful space to be. We would have elders just pop up out of the blue and ask for our collard greens, which was really amazing because people knew where to find us. And so it's really important that we help to preserve some of these green spaces within the city. We can think about the local, the pandemic that we've all experienced, and we were running out of food at a very rapid rate. A lot of local food banks and things like that, there just wasn't enough to go around. And so there was a lot of outsourcing outside of the state that was happening. But if we really started to really incorporate green spaces within the city to be able to provide local food, it really connects to our emergency preparedness that we need to be thinking about. as well, because what happens if there's natural disasters that you don't really have access to distribution through transportation. So it's something to really consider and think about. These are a few of our Pathways to Farming farmers that we work with. They do anything from CSA distribution, community supported agriculture, focusing on vegetable boxes, to value-added products, herbalists and flower farmers and things like that. And they really bring their full selves into the work that they do with community. And so we've had a lot of different instances where we've had community organizing meetings on the farm, or we've had small markets. And Shiny in the picture below does a come through market with lots of BIPOC producers and food entrepreneurs. So it's not only about building community, but it's also opportunity for economic development for many of our small producers, because they're not producing on that large scale like everyone else. And a lot of times our small producers are not monocropping. They are farming a lot of different diverse things in a small space. And so that's something that's really important. I wanted to talk to you about, I don't know if some folks have heard of, they call it, it's like an agrohood model. And so it's having agricultural component to housing units or apartment complexes. So one project that we're really excited about is working with Rockwood 10 community development partners out in the city of Gresham. And they have about 224 apartments for low-income families. We are working with their architects to build out a community farm. And so they're building all the infrastructure for us, and we'll bring the programming and the community, and it will be open, not only to folks that are in the apartment complex, but in that area. And so the farm will be kind of a center meeting point, and they'll have a community center and other things that will be happening. But it will be a chance for people to have access to food and activities for even youth to get involved and engaged in agriculture and have some touch points. There'll be another component around community gardens. So I think they're going to be having about 40 or so community gardens for people that know how to manage gardens. The city of Gresham, there's a very diverse population there. And so it's just a great way to engage with folks and to give them the opportunity to have access to a green space. I wanted to actually show you, don't download it, but this is an example of some of the planning that we're doing around the community farm map. And so it's not a huge space, but we want to have a greenhouse, a shipping container for tools and things like that, have a multi-use path. And this is just us kind of discussing where the water would go. And so we're really working with Multnomah County Office of Sustainability and the developers to create the space for community. Go back to slide. This is just a snapshot of the Boots to Roots program. So the unique thing about the Boots to Roots program was some of the veterans worked at the local VA's community garden plots. And so that's just an example of trying to create kind of therapeutic horticulture experiences for people that have suffered from PTSD. And so we had the Portland VA and then a Vancouver VA location that we created these community garden sites at. And they actually went through the Master Gardeners program and were able to teach gardening classes to community. And the farmers that worked with us as part of the Boots to Roots program were able to grow food and then give it out to folks at a local hospital, Mount Hood Legacy. And so there was like 50 people that would line up every day, every Wednesday to come get food that the veterans grew. And so that was something that they were really proud of. So that middle picture is a picture of some of our lovely veterans. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the amazing growers and network of producers. Some are community organizers, and so we did organize a Back to the Root conference. We have a lot of community partners such as Oregon State University and EcoTrust, and was a co-founder of the Black Food Sovereignty Coalition. And so this was the first year that this Back to the Root conference happened in Corvallis. We've had it in 2019 and 2020, and it was, we were inspired by the Bugs conference that happened over the past 10 years in different spots across the nation. But we are working with a lot of these amazing food entrepreneurs and farmers and organizers to this day. I'm going to kind of speed it up because I don't want to take too much of our time so we can get to the next speaker. One of the things that we are working on is food hubs. And so when we're also thinking about these green spaces, we should also incorporate, food hubs where gardening classes can happen. Thinking about green jobs for youth and creating pathways into green jobs along with the green infrastructure is really needed. We worked with Summer Works program for many years as, providing a site for youth to be able to learn how to, grow food on our farm and to give back to community. And so one of the focus areas with our new nonprofit Feed and Freedom Foundation is going to be focused on greenhouse management training and aquaponics as a way to utilize space, that might be brownfields or things like that. You can't grow directly into the ground. So it's going to require us, when we think and talk about green spaces, to really get creative with the way that we approach, getting people engaged with the agriculture and being able to grow their own food. We do kind of operate from like teaching people how to grow their own food and not just do the food distribution. So we're really looking at creating a Black community food center that will host many of these things. And we're working with a community packing Northwest that will be helping with food entrepreneurs that are creating packaged items to be able to distribute to folks like New Seasons and things like that. So it is, what a lot of what we're doing is focusing on that economic development part, but there's also education that goes into it with community, and folks are just really wanting to get involved and engaged and have access to nature that's, pretty easily for them to walk to in their community. So and lastly, I just wanted to mention a few different areas, because we really want to talk and be thinking about how we talk and think about climate resilience and climate change in all these different areas. I am working with the Black Food Fund to focus on that, and also look at different ways to provide capital for infrastructure needs, specifically for Black farmers and growers. And so this is a picture of some of the team, leadership team that I'm working with that are doing some amazing things. And then lastly, we are looking at the Black Oregon Land Trust. And so how are we looking at some of the public lands that are available, that are just out there and maybe not even being used? And, how can we transfer some of that access to land to land trusts that are focused on getting BIPOC folks onto land to practice their culture and to create community? And so, I think that's about it. That's what I have. And I'm sorry if it was a little bit rushed. I kind of packed in a lot of slides there for you all.
No worries. It was great and inspiring. I would love to talk to you about ideas I have about trying to put a teaching farm in Milwaukee. It's about a 60-acre plot that is sitting there right now. It used to be a farm, and it's been fallow for about 7 or 8 years. Anyway, someday, soon. Our next speaker, Bob Sallinger has been, he's worked for the Portland Audubon since 1992. His current responsibilities include directing Portland Audubon's conservation policy initiatives, wildlife research initiatives, backyard habitat certification program, and wildlife care center. Bob's passion for conservation was developed early exploring the woods of Massachusetts and later on solo hikes from Mexico to Canada on the Pacific Crest Trail and from Canada to southern Colorado on the Continental Divide. Bob has a BA in biology from Reed College and a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School. He currently serves as board president of the Humane Oregon and on the board of the Intertwine Alliance. He previously worked as an adjunct professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School and as an elected director at the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. Bob.
Well, good afternoon, and it's a real honor to be on this panel today with Mayor Gamba and Vivek and Shantae and Kristen as well. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to try and share my screen. I have terrible Zoom karma, so I'll probably screw this up, but we'll see what happens. There it is. And all right. Well, I'm going to actually keep it somewhat high level. I'm going to go back up again. So those were amazing presentations and just hard to follow. So I'm going to talk a little bit from the 10,000 foot level and some of the challenges and opportunities that I see. I've worked on green infrastructure for about 3 decades, and we've made a lot of progress, but we also have a long way to go, and particularly have a long way to go in terms of equity and inclusion, in terms of who benefits, and not just in terms of access, but in terms of the jobs and health and who owns the land. So it's an evolving effort. When I think of urban areas, I think of them kind of like blast zones. I heard a presentation many, many years ago where somebody talked about Mount St. Helens and how when it erupted, basically it cleared everything out. And they thought that the vegetation would come back from the edges, slowly from the edges. But what they found was that there were little pockets of life throughout the entire blast zone, and they would kind of grow together and kind of create these webs of life within the system. And I think of our urban areas, if you look at Portland, it's about the size of the Mount St. Helens blast zone in those ways as well. We have these little pockets of nature, of trees, these remnants, but to a large degree, we've treated our urban areas really, really badly. We've built ignoring nature, and as it's come back, and what still persists is inequitably distributed. And we also know that as we restore the natural environment in our urban ecosystems, it often causes displacement as well. And so systemic inequities that Vivek talks so elegantly about persist. I look at something like the Willamette River, where we have historically at Swan Island, we had this braided river, this amazing fertile floodplain surrounded by wetlands, and we filled those wetlands, we channelized the river, we steepened the banks, we hardened the banks, and today you can see what it looks like at the bottom. We just, similarly across our entire landscape, we've cut down the trees, we've created all kinds of challenges for ourselves, for wildlife, by not considering nature in how we develop. And as you've already heard, we're paying a price for that in terms of pollution, in terms of lack of access, in terms of all the different benefits, property values that nature brings to us. This is an urban heat island map for Portland. And the challenges we're facing today in terms of health, in terms of livability, in terms of economy, are oftentimes tied to the way we have developed our landscape. It has also had serious impacts for wildlife as well. Today, we still have amazing wildlife in our city. I think oftentimes people don't think about our urban areas as biodiversity areas, but in fact, we have amazing wildlife that passes through, that lives in and shares our landscape, and we need to be thinking about that as well. In Portland, we have over 71 fish species, 20 amphibian species, 16 reptile species, 78 mammals, and 229 birds that use our landscape, share our landscape. That's pretty amazing to think about. But we also need to think about the fact that, for example, when fish pass through our landscape, and every salmon that uses the Willamette River system, the 180-mile Willamette River system, has to pass through downtown Portland as it comes and goes from the sea. And we've created an incredibly inhospitable environment for them to pass through. So we need to do things differently. And when I think about green infrastructure, I think about green infrastructure as a way that we're going to repair that blast zone, reconnect to our landscape. And, you know, I think first and foremost about a system of parks, trails, and natural areas that sort of form the backbone of a green infrastructure system. I think about a regulatory system that protects critical natural resources, waterways, and a variety of other natural resources. That I think about things like green streets and eco-routes and urban tree canopy, urban agriculture. How do we link all these things in to create a habitable, equitable, hospitable landscape for ourselves and for the wildlife that we share this landscape on? And how do we make sure that that is truly equitably distributed and benefits everybody? And so I would offer that we need to think about nature being part of the foundation of every single project that we do. That nature ought to be incorporated in at the beginning, not at the end. Too often, it is a bell, a whistle, something we add on to a project at the end, rather than thinking about the landscape that we're living on, working on, and how we can improve the health of that landscape and the health of the people on it. That to me begins with thinking about green infrastructure as a foundational piece of a project, not as the last piece we add in. And I look at something like the I-5 Rose Quarter project, expanding Interstate 5, $1 billion project. It's been over a decade in the works. And the only significant natural resource impact it's going to have is that it's going to create more toxic air pollution, so that the children at Harriet Tubman School, which abuts this, will have to spend their resources, their recesses indoors. That's appalling. We have to do better than that. The idea that we could have a $1 billion project in an historically Black neighborhood where people have been displaced, the environment has been decimated, the air quality is terrible, that we could spend over a decade and come up with $1 billion project where the only significant environmental outcome is that children will have to spend more time indoors, is outrageous. And I think it speaks to a fundamental deficiency in how we approach our landscape. I would offer Tabor to the River, which is a project that happened many years ago, as an example of how we might want to think differently. Tabor to the River was a project where the city of Portland had to replace old water pipes. And rather than doing it the traditional way, which was simply to replace the pipes, which would have cost about $144 million, they instead took this significant area of Portland in terms of its size and thought about how they could incorporate green infrastructure into the project. And to do that, they looked at green streets, urban tree canopy, park restoration, a variety of different strategies. And what they found was that by building the green infrastructure into this project, they could lower the cost from $144 million to $81 million. So a savings of $63 million. And one thing about green infrastructure is it really can save us money when it comes to urban stormwater and a variety of other challenges we face. What do? They integrated 3,500 street trees, 500 green streets or bioswales. They did put in some new sewer pipe. They restored the parks and 100 private property stormwater retrofits, and then did a lot of community outreach and education. We need to approach our landscape scale projects, both small and big, from this kind of a perspective. And I would add that simply putting in these amenities is not enough. We need to really work with the community, because this needs to be built from the community up. There needs to be community buy-in. It needs to reflect local community values. It needs to provide jobs to underserved communities. It needs to prevent displacement. There need to be a whole slew of strategies in place, because we know that when you do this kind of work, again, it often causes displacement. Often the people there are not the ones that ultimately benefit from this. But we need to think proactively about our landscape and come at it from a nature first perspective when we're redeveloping. We need to elevate nature in the land use planning process. And here I would point folks to, we have amazing statewide land use planning goals, but they're not all equal in how they're applied. And I think it's important to note that nature in our statewide land use planning goals that guides how our cities evolve and develop over time often is not required in the way that other goals are. And I want to just give you a quick comparison. Goal 5, which is natural resources goal, requires that municipalities inventory their natural resources. So we need to know what we have left. But then they have to decide through an economic, social, environmental, and energy analysis what resources should be protected, partially protected, or unprotected, and then justify the decision. That allows them to balance out the environment. There are no set goals. It's basically an inventory and then decide what you're going to do goal. Goal 9, on the other hand, which is economic development, requires that a city inventory its industrial and commercial lands and then set aside enough land to meet a 20-year supply demand. That's not optional, that's mandatory. We have to have land for commercial and industrial development. We don't have to have land for nature. We can balance that away. And each time we do the rebalancing, we lose more and more. That has driven in many municipalities a need, especially in cities like Portland that are built out, to find more and more industrial land, more and more commercial land, and we transfer land only really in one direction. Because the value goes up as it becomes more and more developed, we tend to move land from open space to industrial to commercial to residential. This paradigm that we're in with our land use planning has resulted in a situation, for example, in Portland, where we've been unable to update natural resource protections and codes on industrial lands. We have been unable to implement our tree code on industrial lands. It's led to opposition to cleaning up Portland Harbor Superfund site. And also it's led to efforts to convert places like West Hayden Island, an 800-acre natural area, to industrial development. Because we're not required to meet targets for environmental health, but we are required to meet targets for other uses, we transfer these lands into other types of uses. West Hayden Island, by the way, was successfully opposed by Audubon, the Yakima Nation, and Oregon's largest manufactured home community, which is adjacent to it, which rose up and said, no, this is not okay. We want our environment protected, and we need to make sure that nature is part of the picture. We need to capture the real costs of our environmental impacts. This is South Waterfront. It was underwater in 1996. It's in a flood zone. We tend to build in flood zones far too often. And this is what it looks like at the bottom in 2017, Oregon's largest, most dense housing development. In this case, the city waived environmental regulations that would have been in place to protect those floodways, those flood zones, and require mitigation for developing the floodplain. It was so expensive to do that because the environmental impacts were so severe that we just waived the cost of actually mitigating for those impacts. So it's critically important that we actually capture the real costs of environmental impacts, make developers pay for those, and protect our environment as we develop out our landscapes. Too often, I believe that I'm getting to the end, that we use equity sometimes as a way, unfortunately, to perpetuate inequities that have occurred on our landscape. And I'm gonna give you a couple of examples. Equity sometimes is used to argue that if we protect our environment and we do the kinds of things we need to do, plant trees, that'll drive up property values, that will cost more development costs. We won't have enough affordable housing, it will drive up pricing and so on. As a result, we have things like, for example, in Portland, downtown, you are required to put eco-roofs on buildings. That benefits the more wealthy parts of the city, but we don't have that same requirement in other parts of the city that need these kind of amenities far more, that are affected by the kinds of things that Vivek talked about earlier. And the argument being that those communities can't afford to do these things because it would drive up costs. That's unacceptable. What we really need to do is say that we need to put our natural resource protections, our green infrastructure projects into the places that need them most. And we need to come up with funding strategies that actually subsidize those, that make them possible, that lead to situations where underserved communities benefit from these kinds of green infrastructure strategies, but also keep the cost such that it doesn't cause displacement, it doesn't harm communities that are already challenged. And I think about things like the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which was a frontline community-led initiative a couple of years back. We were proud to be part of it in a supporting role that put a tax on a business license fee on big corporations in Portland, and channeled that money toward climate resiliency, green infrastructure, urban agriculture, and is now producing upwards of $60 million a year distributed in grants so that we can make sure that when we do this kind of work and we start to think at a landscape scale and we get green infrastructure into our communities, that we also have the funding resources to make sure that it is equitably distributed and doesn't damage the communities in which it's going into. So I look at that as a sign of hope and the kind of thing that we need to think a lot more about. We need to incorporate green infrastructure to every project. We need to do it in a way that brings in community values and empowers communities. We need to make sure that the wide range of benefits are all included, from the design, the ownership, the jobs, the property value benefits, and the health benefits. And we need to find new sources of money and new ways to fund things to ensure that it is truly equitably distributed, that it's not just the folks that already have a lot that get more. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. We do have a couple of good questions from the audience. Before I ask those, I'm going to throw one out for you to think about for the next little bit and then give me an answer at the end. Selfishly, I'm going to ask if there was one policy that you would have every city enact, what would it be? So think about that, and then we will ask these questions that we're getting from the audience. From Al Hag, have you seen any examples of municipal programs, city adaptations to incentivize the removal of impervious surfaces during private development. Anybody who has, please pipe up.
It's a tough one, Mayor. Was someone ready to respond?
I would just say that I have, we have great programs like DPAVE that are tearing up impervious surfaces and do amazing work. And I think there's more and more programs like that, but they're nowhere near enough. And I think we really need to think about things like a no net gain of impervious surface policy, where we are actually making headway and reducing impervious surface. In fact, municipalities may have to look at something like that, at least when they develop in floodplains. A lawsuit that we brought several years ago against FEMA over the flood insurance program that they subsidize has resulted in a situation where cities may have to look at no net loss of permeable surface in floodplains. But I think we could do a lot more. I think we'd be a lot more aggressive about that kind of a thing.
Dr. Shandas, you look like you were also, no, I'm unmuted now.
No, you're good.
You look like you were about to offer something as well.
Well, it's really a direct, it's really, I tend to think about these landscapes as socially constructed adaptive landscapes. We decide in so many ways what we're working with. And if the resources go to, expanding roads versus depaving roads, those are decisions we're all making as a community. And that, I think, is what Bob is speaking to. And whether we're putting urban agriculture in a specific site, or we're creating greater amounts of impervious surface for the water to run off and pollute our streams, like those are decisions we're making. So at each individual contextual level, if there are no challenges to the development process in terms of lot edge to lot edge development, that's what we'll see happen. And that's what I've largely observed empirically across cities we've studied, is that there are right now greater incentives for square footage than there are for creating green spaces on private property. So in the Portland, for example, with the Portland Urban Forestry Commission, we were working with Better Housing by Design, which is an urban multifamily development project, to try to bring in examples of how the multifamily residential development that goes in, often it's this horseshoe design with a big patch of black asphalt pavement right in the middle for parking. And so we ran a series of simulation models to look at how having the same number of units with different designs could actually increase the likelihood of green infrastructure, while also reducing overall net gain in temperatures for that development. And it's not so much a question of whether it can or can't be, well, I guess it's not so much a question of the fact that we can increase density while also maintaining green spaces and reducing temperatures. It's really whether there's the social, political, and of course, private interest in being able to do this. And so whether there are incentives given to it, whether it's done through requirements, like those are conversations I think we need to keep having.
We're toying with a couple of different policy ideas that would affect this. One is to base stormwater charges on pervious, like ratio of pervious surfaces. Another is looking at making neighborhood streets VUNRFs, which is a smaller paved area that is designed for people to be. You would expect to see bicycles, you would expect to see people walking, you would expect to see kids playing, and the car is a guest. So instead of someplace to drive fast through to get to that freeway or to that arterial, it's someplace you are meant to drive slow, and all the other ways of transporting ourselves are prioritized, which then cuts down on sidewalks that are more impervious surfaces, and all of that builds out, parking, right, the bane of our existence. That takes up huge amounts of asphalt, and that would be reduced in those concepts as well. Shantae, did you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next?
Oh, I was just going to say that really just making sure that we're preserving agricultural lands is really important. I know that gets harder and harder when you're in the city because there's so much development that has already happened. But once you develop, develop spaces that were prior prime agricultural land, you can't get that back. It's very hard to return back to how that land was flourishing beforehand. And so if that could be kind of prioritized, that would be great. And also looking at really making sure that we implement green spaces for agriculture, and working with either small producers or folks that provide garden education or garden boxes or things like that community members could utilize, I think is going to be really important. Another aspect that I forgot to mention with my presentation was around procurement. So there does need to be a focus on the procurement and contracting portion of a lot of this work, and thinking about how we're working with community that's already there in community doing some of the work, whether it's grassroots organizations working around the infrastructure needs to keep that to build out those agricultural spaces, like Bob mentioned with the Portland Clean Energy Fund, is a really great example of providing support and capital to BIPOC folks focused on clean energy. And there was something else that I was going to mention. I don't know. I'll just stop there.
All right, that was good addition.
Mayor,
yeah.
Do you mind? This is Kirsten. So on Al's question, we kicked off all the DLCD staff off this webinar so that we could preserve the space for other folks. So other sort of our regional reps might have some guidance on that, but I think I'd like to also put that question out to the Oregon Planners Network listserv, which is about 1,500 planners around the state, and ask that question, Al. So if you're not on there, please feel free to send one of us an email and I can help get back to you on that, because that's a very fascinating question. Thank you, and to all the panelists for your responses. Thanks, Mayor.
You bet. See, Leah Lasavita has a good question. In areas where there is gentrification, do you see a converse increase in resources deducted to beautifying the landscape?
Maybe just a quick touch on that. I often hear the question of greening neighborhoods, gentrifying neighborhoods, the potential, which again, the empirical evidence on that is relatively thin, but it's something to certainly have conversations about and think about displacement as a result of greening and green infrastructure projects, because that comes up a lot. And so this question is interesting, kind of nuance to that. It's asking like, in areas that are gentrifying, is there money being pulled out or left out of greening landscaping efforts? And areas that are undergoing gentrification are often recipients of large amounts of capital in not only the development process, but also in the landscaping process. So if there is space available, developers are often bringing green spaces into the areas that are undergoing lots of change. That's not always the case because it all depends on that developer. It all depends on kind of the permitting and the requirements that are put forward in that site. But what we're seeing is that there is a large growth that's happened in terms of development in the areas that were historically redlined, meaning the C and D grades, if you remember those. Over the last 40 years, that's where the largest population growth has happened in cities across the West Coast, is in the C and D areas that were redlined. And that's really telling to me because those are very permissive spaces. They really allow for people to go in and developers to go in and really increase the density of those developments. And housing is certainly something we need. So there's nothing against that, though the way that housing is being played out is often reducing the likelihood of private green spaces. And then it becomes like that tiny little highly competitive median strip between the sidewalk and the road becoming the only space that green infrastructure can compete. And that becomes, of course, a very challenging proposition for a lot of communities. So I haven't seen necessarily either a great deal of investment into green spaces with gentrification in neighborhoods or any empirical evidence I would suggest otherwise. So yeah, that's an open question I would at least suggest with what we know now.
Good. Bob or Shantae, anything? Okay. Thank you. You actually answered the question that she probably intended to ask and I misread. So well done. You psychically heard her. The next question comes from Kate Jackson, and it is, are there concerns about water scarcity, use of treated drinking water for farming versus irrigation district supplies for agricultural use?
I would say, yeah, there is concerns around water scarcity within the agricultural field for sure. I know that as part of the environmental equity committee that I'm on, there is a lot of conversation around water infrastructure support that is happening currently right now, and the need for funding. And so, depending on what type of farming you're doing, conventional versus operating, as a small producer, the water needs could be different. And I think that, within agriculture, sometimes conservation for some farmers isn't always the focus, but I do believe here in Oregon, there is a lot of support around how to make sure that we're working with organizations such as NRCS to get farmers to start to use drip irrigation versus overhead and start to preserve some of our water. And so,
isn't it true that the healthier the soil is, the less water is required to be able to be productive?
Yeah, there are a lot of people that are doing a lot of experiments around dry farming, and because of climate change and just because of the way that a lot of folks have been farming for generations, it does require us to get a little bit more creative. I mean, we're seeing a lot of impacts when it comes to our crops and on farm. Stuff is starting to bolt earlier because the weather's starting to get hot. People are having to really adjust the ways that they practice growing, and regenerative agriculture is going to be really where it's at. I know that the Oregon Department of Agriculture is really focused on soil health and creating a department that specifically focuses on, regenerative ag and how to support producers in making those changes, whether it be no-till or, just making sure that their soil is protected and taken care of, because water can eventually run out.
Yeah, I think that is the looming, that and having killed all of our topsoil, I believe that the looming threat to humanity is an inability to actually maintain our own lives, because we've destroyed the potable water and topsoil to such a great degree that it won't support the population. Let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions. Are you, Kirsten?
No, Mayor, just a request to share the slide deck from today's presentation. Evan, I'm not sure if you've asked presenters if they're willing. I know Dr. Shandas, I was going to ask you if there was a paper where some of that findings was published, and I may have known that, but if you'd like to let us know that too, we'll put that out in a post email to folks. And Mayor, you had asked a question that you asked people to ponder, so I think it's back to you for your question. Thank you.
All right, so I'll re-ask, since this has been a busy afternoon. If there were one policy that you would want every city to enact in this realm, what would it be? Go ahead, Dr. Shandas.
Mine is pretty simple. It would probably be 5 words: no net gain in temperature. That would be pretty much it. 5 words.
And my staff would lose their minds.
You didn't say anything about reality, but this is actually achievable. We've been able to do the analysis. It's actually achievable. It's just a matter of how we design our spaces.
Yeah, no, I totally get it, and I think it is achievable. Bob or Shantae, either one of you have an answer ready?
I can jump in. I like the idea of no net increase in temperature. I think that's a very good strategy, because it would force us to really think holistically about these projects. It would force us in a totally different paradigm. I guess for variety's sake, I'll stick with the one I put out there, which is that every municipal project has to begin with green infrastructure and how we are going to seek green strategies to mimic the natural functions of the landscape, and that we should start there and build from that, and think of every project as being transformative of the landscape as opposed to business as usual. And I think kind of the Rose Quarter example I gave of this incredibly inequitable, unlivable landscape that we have, and we could spend 10 years and $1 billion and come back and say, let's just make it worse. We need to be thinking really differently from the ground up.
And I would say, similar to what I've already mentioned about making sure that some of these green spaces have agricultural use in mind, and also looking at our reenacting the conservation core is going to be really important, so that we can start to get some of more plants in the ground, and implementation of all the great projects that are going to come around green infrastructure. And so if we can create jobs through a conservation core that would support urban farmers and green spaces in general, I think that would be really great.
That's great. Okay, I think there's a new question here. How do communities overcome the opposition to raising livestock in residential areas? While you guys are thinking about that, I'll throw out my answer is elect a crazy mayor who will allow unlimited chickens and bees and goats on properties.
How's that working in Milwaukee, Mayor?
It's not quite unlimited. My staff is probably freaking out right now if they're listening. But I think it's like 40 chickens or something like that. And beehives were illegal when I took office. They are no longer illegal. Goats were, you had to jump through some serious hoops and call them pets and all these things, and that's gone away. So we're moving in the right direction. You'd probably be hard pressed to have a pig farm in the middle of Milwaukee, but otherwise.
Thank you.
Maybe just a pet pig. We did actually have pigs and chickens at the Oregon Food Bank farm, but they were just, it was a small group of them, like 10 chickens and 1 pig.
Well, it's really interesting. There's a guy at the Milwaukee Farmers Market that raises pork, and he's doing it on a defunct Christmas tree farm, which of course has utterly depleted soils. So he's using the pigs as free range pigs to restore that soil. That's the whole purpose of him farming pigs, is to restore soil. So it is an interesting paradigm to start to think about of how we sort of stack uses and purposes.
I'll just maybe offer that, changing social perceptions is a long game, and it really is about trying to move at multiple angles, from what you're saying, Mayor Gamba, about policies and leadership, to kind of local engagement of communities, to potentially finding ameliorative solutions from, like, for example, we know that noise is a concern, and green infrastructure is really known to also help with noise amelioration. So there's a connection there that can be potentially imagined. And I mean, on a side note, I'll just say I kind of chuckle at this because I grew up in South India on the streets where there are chickens and goats and cows and all kinds of other animals that were part of my everyday existence. And as a kid, I didn't think anything of it. And it was one of those things that I would have names for these little creatures that I would see every day when I walked to school. And it became kind of a more of a habituated experience. And it really was one of the instrumental moments for me becoming more comfortable with a true deep urban ecology that I grew up with. And that really, when you think about the benefits and the challenges of bringing more creatures into our urban areas, it can, I think, have lots of really positive and beneficial things for how we commune with nature and how we connect to the broader forces that we're all part of.
Agreed. Bob, anything to add? Shantae?
Mayor, if we can eke it in, there's one. Oh, Bob, go ahead. Sorry. The question was to you.
No, but I'd just say, as a goat owner, a bee owner, and a chicken owner, and also a homing pigeon owner, I'm very supportive.
All right, one more question. And I can't see who this was from, but it was, I am intrigued by Dr. Shandas' assertion that we can grow denser and greener. What are some examples and policies that work well to make that happen?
Yeah, it really comes down to how we're developing and designing. And I don't want to take up too much space on this, but I'll just say that when you think about the way that developers often move forward, it's often about what is the lowest cost approach and where can I find land that can return the ROI, return on investment. And so part of what we're examining and things like this accessory dwelling unit emergence of living smaller, living bigger through small living, or something like that, like these ADU examples for higher densities, like that really gave us an understanding, working with banks and working with others, that there was financial models to be able to retrofit existing garages, basements, other existing developments so that they were safe, habitable, and increasing the housing stock little by little, yard by yard. And so these examples of how we've been able to transform landscapes through really modest ways of understanding shifts in the way, for example, with multifamily residential development, as I was saying, the conventional approach has been this parking lot centric design. And while people don't want to give up their parking, what we've been able to model is ways to be able to tuck parking in to the development so that there is greater space in and around that development, allowing for large mature trees to be planted, or potentially large trees to be planted, getting green infrastructure on the roofs of the buildings, which again has become increasingly cost effective, getting small green ag opportunities in that space that's generally used for parking lots. And so it really comes down to a design question. And I think we're getting far more, and I'm grateful to be part of a university that's actually graduating students who are so interested in these questions of urban design and kind of thinking about green spaces as integrated. And I think that's what it's going to take, is likely a generational shift when it comes to some of these questions of integrating, sewing in and surgically implanting green spaces in some of these developments.
Yeah, that's probably a good topic for our next whole entire webinar or colloquium or several day symposium. Actually, sir, to close it down if you'd like, or take us home.
Well, it's been really enjoyable, impressive, and just a taster, I think, of what these three minds would be able to feed us in a longer process. It sounds also like there were a lot of really interesting people in the audience that I would love to be in conversation with. So I think that there's more to be. This is the beginning, right, Kirsten? More coming. And I look forward to seeing them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Please do sign up for those email updates and just stay engaged. It's going to take all of us to figure out how to grow better together. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, panelists. Thanks, Shantae, Vivek, and Bob. Really appreciate you getting rave reviews on text and other modes. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you, everybody.